Hi, I'm Pete and welcome to Just a Few Acres Farm. Those of you that have been following our channel know that this season we've been experimenting with a bunch of different grazing systems, focusing on mob grazing, and I've been tearing my hair out trying to find the best system for our farm and other small farms. We have a herd of 35 Dexters and we graze about 30 acres, and I've come up with new grazing system that's really a hybrid of a bunch of different types that I think works really well on our farm and could work really well on your farm. I got a lot to go over in this video. I'm going to crunch it in as fast as I can, so stay tuned. Before I get started, please do not send me to another channel to learn how somebody else grazes. Grazing is unique to every farm, and that's something that's the first thing you learn when you start farming. You don't just adopt somebody else's approach, you modify it. And I've studied them all. I started out with Joel Saladin, who's been mob grazing for at least 25 years. Alan Nation, the former editor of the Stockman Grass Farmer. Alan Savory, who was a pioneer with mob grazing, right through to the work of Alan Williams, who's pioneered adaptive grazing lately. I've looked at them all. I have the smarts to combine what they do into a single grazing system that's most appropriate for small herds on small farms. Our cows are 35 in total. You can use this method with as few as 5 cows, I think, and it'll work great. Finding the best grazing model for your farm is all about knowing your farm, knowing the land, knowing the climate, knowing the species of forage that you're growing, knowing your breed of cattle, knowing how heavily your land is loaded. These are huge variables, and you have to figure out for yourself the best way to graze it. What I'm going to give you here is a set of principles that can be adapted to almost any farming situation where you're grazing animals. The funny thing is, we've been grazing cattle for 7 years now, and by year 3 I had most of the principles for a sound grazing system for our cattle. But this spring, for some reason, I felt we had to shoehorn our farm into the, quote, most modern grazing systems, or the ones that were the newest, and try and figure that out here. And it didn't work very well. Mob grazing just doesn't work very well for a herd this size, and I'll get to why. But I took a step back and I realized, geez, I have it almost all here. I just need to refine it a little bit, and those refined set of principles are what I'm going to go over next. I'm calling this system no-nonsense grazing, and part of the reason I'm calling it that is because I'm not very good with coming up with catchy names. And the second reason is because there's no nonsense. It's based on what you can see with your own eyes, not what somebody else is promising you will happen. There are 8 principles to this grazing system, and here they are. Number 1, seek to keep your cattle on pasture that's in its optimal protein, fiber, balanced stage of growth. Number 2, make hay when the forage gets ahead of you. Number 3, limit stockpiled forage that's declined in nutritional value. Instead, cut it at optimal nutritional value for hay and store it for later feeding. Number 4, pay particular attention to the performance of clover, which is probably your cattle's most desirable forage and your best protein source. Them taking it down to the ground is a sure marker of overgrazing. Number 5, make daily paddocks. Keep your cattle on the same piece of ground no longer than 24 hours. Number 6, clip your pastures once in late spring after the cattle have gone over mature areas. This is to speed the incorporation of dead seed heads into the soil, mulch the soil against further moisture loss, and limit the spread of invasive weed species. Number 7, take care to fine-tune your cattle land loading ratio to ensure about 25% trample to both insulate the soil and build new soil. And finally, number 8, thank your soil. Give back to it by allowing the cattle to trample about 25% of the forage they go over, and feed it every year with composted manure made from your winter bedding packs. Now, if you're raising other animals on your farm that you're feeding grain to, like pigs and chickens, you can incorporate their compost into this and actually make your farm nutrient positive. These principles differ from both rotational grazing and mob grazing, which I think the two get confused a lot, so let me quickly define them. Rotational grazing is moving the cattle around different paddocks, which are usually made out of temporary fencing, and the cattle stay on each paddock from a few days up to a few weeks. Mob grazing moves cattle to new paddocks at least once a day, and most often twice a day, and at a very, very high loading. My method of grazing is a hybrid of rotational and mob grazing, particularly adapted to small herds, small farm environments. Now, why follow these principles? Well, the overriding reason is to keep your cattle on optimal forage year-round. That means in the summer, you're having them on optimal forage in the pasture, which for us is a growth stage between 8 and 12 inches. And in the winter, you're feeding them optimal forage that's been dried. You made hay off optimal forage in the summer. You're minimizing past peak stockpiled forage, which is way past its prime and of much less nutritional quality. The thing about stockpiled forages, and I disagree with this common belief completely, is that you don't need to keep cattle in their first and second trimester on anything but sort of medium to crappy forage because they don't need the energy. And I think that's a ton of bull on a small farm, because you've got one herd and you've got your growing out steers mixed with your mama cows, mixed with your calves, and you want to keep optimal forage for them all to grow out the steers the best, and to ensure that any cull cows that you have going that you're sending for meat are nice and fat when they go to the butcher. Second reason, this method gives back to the pasture system. You can't just take and take from pasture endlessly. It's a limited resource. You need to put nutrients back into the system. And this method does that by allowing for trampled grass to be built into new soil and sequester carbon, and to supplement that with composted manure, which really boosts soil microbial life and thinks about the whole system, not just the plants growing on top. Third reason, when you have a small herd, it's very difficult to make mob grazing work. And the reason is, it's hard to justify moving them more than once a day. And what happens, and we experimented with this and actually did the calculations out in the field this year, when you approach densities of 100,000 pounds per acre and really clamp down on things, but you're leaving them for 24 hours, the cattle inevitably have the time to go back over and nip the choicest forage, clover and alfalfa, right down to the dirt. And you don't want that happening, and there's no way to get around it without moving them more than once per day. So this method opens up that paddock size compared to mob grazing and gives cattle enough land so that they can eat that choice pasture, clover and alfalfa, without taking it all the way to the ground every day. And the key to optimal paddock size is looking at your paddocks after they've been grazed and making sure that the cattle haven't taken the clover or alfalfa down to less than 3 inches in height. As an example, and I got to look at my grazing log on my phone to give you the numbers, at 100,000 pounds per acre, our grazing 35 head, according to my calculations, we're grazing 8,400 square foot or 0.19 acres per day. That was with mob grazing, and we had disastrous results with that. If we double that and go to about 16,000 square feet or a third of an acre, it results in our legumes not being taken down too far. So to summarize, in these forage conditions, in the dry months of summer that we're seeing right now, we're operating at about half of the cattle density of mob grazing. We're operating at 50,000 pounds per acre for a daily paddock versus what mob grazing would say with a minimum 100,000 pounds per acre. And another key difference, we're not employing the resting time for the pastures that mob grazing would employ. We're resting our pastures much less because we want to catch forage at optimal blend of protein and fiber to make it most palatable and most nutritious to the cows. On a small acreage, we can't afford to wait 60 or 90 days to put the cattle back onto grass. We're running through about every 45 days. Now, let's put this system into practice for a year and see how it works. Let's start with spring turnout, and for us that's mid-April. We turn the cattle out onto the grass when it's 6 to 8 inches tall, and at this time we graze the cattle in wide open areas, typically about 5-acre fields for our 35 head herd, and we're supplementing with fiber-rich hay because the grass is very lacking in fiber at this point. We leave the cattle on these 5-acre paddocks for a couple days up to a week until the grass really gets going. Late spring comes, and here that's around mid-May, and the forage starts to take off. So what do? We crunch the paddock size down, we start giving them daily paddocks, and we move the fence every day. And at that time, we fine-tune what our paddock size needs to be for that season. You won't know the optimal paddock size right away, and you have to fine-tune it as you start moving them daily. And the way to do that is, after you've had them on it for a day and you move them, look at the forage that's left. You're looking for about 25% trampled, and you're looking for the choicest forage, your legumes, not to be shorter than 3 inches tall. If they get taken down too much, widen your daily paddock or make it bigger. If they don't take enough, narrow it up so they take more. In just a few weeks, if it's a normal year, the forage will get ahead of you and you'll wind up having to graze your cattle in over mature forage. But you want to limit that as much as possible. If you have enough pasture ahead of you, make hay to get that forage off while it's still close to its premium stage. But don't hurt yourself by cutting too much hay and then running out of forage in the pasture early. You got to leave enough ahead of yourself to prepare for those hot, dry months when the forage growth slows down. Once the cattle have gone through that over mature forage, you're going to wind up with a percentage of dead seed heads standing above the pasture. Go through after the cattle at this stage, clip those dead seed heads, catch any weeds that have grown up to limit their spread, and use that dead material that falls on the ground to help mulch the soil and protect it against the coming hot, dry months. Different from the traditional clipping of pastures where you run the mower right down on the ground like you're making hay, mow high. You want that dense material that's down toward the ground to stay there after the cattle have gone over. You just want to catch the high stuff, the weeds and the seed heads. So in our case, I adjust our hay-bind shoes way up to the highest setting and run over all of that tall stuff and keep the short stuff in place. And then the heat of summer comes. For us, that's late June through early September, which we're in the middle of right now, and the forage growth slows way down. Here's the real test of whether you're loading your land properly. If you've loaded your land properly with cattle, you should be grazing on optimal stage forage right through that period. So the grass is growing slower, but you're moving through it and catching it right when it's optimal stage. Plus, a further test is you should have enough excess pasture growth during all those months to take at least one more cutting of optimal quality hay. And throughout this, when I'm saying optimal quality hay, for our species, which is Timothy, alfalfa, red and white clover, perennial ryegrass, and orchard grass, we are grazing or cutting hay when it is between 8 and 12 inches high, and at about 12 inches high is when the Timothy and orchard grass start to send up seed heads. You want to catch it before those actually come out, and you want to catch it before the alfalfa starts to bloom. The clover can be blooming, but you don't want it to get so tall that it starts to lean over. Late August, early September comes and we get a little burst in forage growth with the fall rains, but it's a shorter duration than what we had in the spring. We start to open up our paddocks again in the fall as the grass growth slows down with the shorter days and cooler temperature. We make whatever hay that we have left before the dews get too heavy and the days get too short in September, and then we graze through whatever we've got left. Now, we pull the cattle off the pasture a few weeks after the first frost, which around here is around the beginning of October, and we try to do that in sufficient time that the grass can have some growth and have some time to store some energy back in its roots to survive through the winter and get a good start next spring. So that means we're pulling cattle off the pasture sometime in October through early November, and we're starting our hay feeding season. So hay feeding starts, and this is the last important phase of this approach. We store and we feed our hay inside. That way we minimize waste, and we keep, because this plan is all about optimal forage quality, we keep the hay in optimal condition. We don't let it get rained on and sit for a few days outside before the cattle eat it. It stays dry. They make the most efficient use of it, and we can carry the most cattle on a small acreage by not wasting 30 to 50% of our hay, either by unrolling it on the ground or feeding it in bale rings outside. And remember, and this is the funny thing that I hear about the benefits of unrolling hay on the ground, that hay is getting incorporated back into the field one way or the other. Either you're unrolling it directly on the ground and it's mulching into the ground, or, in my opinion, this is a much better way, you're feeding it to the cows, sending it through to the cows, composting it, and then putting it back on the ground where it's a much better source of nutrition for the soil than just dead hay sitting on the ground to be eventually reincorporated. Either way, you're running a balanced system because everything that you're taking off the pasture, you're putting back on it. So how are you capturing and collecting all that manure and keeping it in a state where you capture the most nitrogen possible? You're doing that by building a tall bedding pack, just as Joel Salatin does in the wintertime in your barn, and adding carbon via wood chips or straw or something like that. And you're composting it for at least a year afterwards. Now you can either compost it in place in the barn if you're doing tall packs like Joel Salatin does, or you can do it like we do, where we don't build a tall pack, but instead we clean out the bedding pack every few months, we pile it and compost it and turn it over the course of a year, and then that carbon and locked in nitrogen, which is different from when a cow just drops a paddy on the field. You're locking it in through that carbon source, and the combination of nitrogen-rich manure and carbon is locking that nitrogen in through microbiotic activity, and you're putting that back on the field. Much richer source of nutrients, much richer source of probiotic shot to the pasture, because that composted manure is loaded with beneficial decomposer bacteria. And that completes the cycle. You've gone through a year, and if you're doing it right year after year, your pasture systems are spiraling up because you're building good soil and you're grazing in the proper fashion to create more and more yield out of your pastures. Here's something that absolutely kills me about modern thinking about the best way to graze, and that is that haymaking has somehow been vilified. If you're not stockpiling forage for the whole winter, you've somehow failed. I think that's screwy, and I disagree completely. If you make hay when forage is in its optimum condition, you are feeding your cattle a much better source of nutrition than over-mature grass that's been sitting in the field for 2, 3, 4 months declining. In fact, here, where we can get 150 inches of snowfall in a year, that hay, or that stockpiled forage, is about that tall by the time the cattle get to it. It's crappy stuff. I'm not feeding my cattle that stockpiled forage in January. And the fossil fuel energy inputs for making hay are really low if you're making hay on your own land. If you're buying in hay from another farm, you're buying in hay with more fossil fuel embedded in it because it has to be trucked to your farm. And this idea that somehow buying in hay is a way to regenerate soil is crap, because you're just stealing from somebody else's nutrition bank to add it to your own. It's a zero-sum equation. Make your own hay on your own farm, balance your own books as far as nutrients go. And if you don't have the equipment to make hay, just hire a custom haymaker. They're all over the place, and it's pretty cheap to get your hay done. So, after much hand-wringing and mental gymnastics about how to make mob grazing work on our small farm, I've realized it really doesn't work. And this set of principles that I'm incorporating, I know have worked because we've used most of them for years on our farm. We're just tuning them to create more give back to the soil. I think that this set of principles can work on a lot of small farms, and I want to stress that I'm not giving you a step-by-step, do this, do this, do this, do this, like a patented approach that I want to sell to you. I'm giving you a set of principles that you can adapt to use on your own farm, because when you look down the list, they're all about just keeping cattle on optimum forage, feeding them optimum forage through the winter, and giving back to your soil. These are things that apply to any farm, and you can go through a whole host of specific grazing techniques about how often you move your cattle. And as long as you follow these principles, you'll have successful grazing. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. I'd be happy to answer them. As always, with everything on our farm, this is a work in progress, but I feel like these 8 principles are something that we can truly live by and increase the health of our pastures every day. Thanks for joining me, and have a good day.